Okay, everybody. Welcome to the PI Education webinar for September. I'm Hal Humphreys. I am the executive editor at Pursuit Magazine and director of education here at PI Education. I want to give a quick shout out to the fine folks over at TLOXP, TransUnion TLOXP. They're kind of my go-to source to get started with research, and that's what we're going to be talking about today is research. I want to be clear, they're not paying for this ad. I just feel strongly that they're a really good resource, and I like to give them a shout out when I can. So hello. Couple of disclaimers real quick. First off, this is not legal advice. We're not attorneys. We're not telling you what's legal, what's not legal. We're not here to tell you how to do the job. We're here to offer some suggestions. These are our opinions, the opinion of myself and Brian Willingham, who's going to be joining us today. They are not the opinions of Pursuit Magazine, nor are they necessarily the opinions of PI Education. They're just our opinions, and we're happy to share them with you in the hopes that it may be useful for you. So those are the disclaimers. As we're presenting this webinar, you have the chance to ask questions. In the YouTube channel, you see there on the right-hand side, there's a live chat function. You can post your questions there, and Brian and I will try to get through them in a timely fashion and share those with you, share the answers with you as we can. I'm going to go ahead and ask Brian to join us here. Brian Willingham and I have known each other for several years now. He is one of the best investigators in the country when it comes to due diligence and open source intelligence research. I have gone to Brian on a number of occasions asking him to help me figure out how to do a thing, how to find a thing, how to do a search. He's generous with his time. If you go to diligentiagroup.com, that's Brian's website. He has one of the most amazing blogs in the PI community. I know a lot of you probably visit there already. If you haven't, you should. He's got some good tips and tricks for things you can do to make your life a little bit easier as a private investigator. Brian and I had an online relationship for a couple of years before we actually met in person and swiped right, so to speak. The first time we met in person was in Madrid. Brian, do you remember that?
I remember very vividly, Hal.
We were, my wife and I had been in Spain for a little bit, and Brian had been there for some time, and we online just kind of connected and said, hey, I'm going to be in Madrid on this day. And Brian said, well, I'm in Madrid this week. And we ended up sitting down in the Plaza Mayor and having a beer and sharing a dinner together. And it was our first in-person introduction. So anyway, ladies and gentlemen, Brian Willingham. Brian, take a little bit of time and tell us who you are and what you do.
Sure. That whole online relationship sounds a little kinky, Hal. I like it. So I've been a private investigator for about 15 years now. 2001 is when I first joined the business. I started at my father's investigative firm here in Westchester County, New York. I kind of joined the industry at a sort of interesting time, at least for the business that my father was involved with. He had, I think like a lot of investigators, he had done a lot of insurance and disability claim work, doing a lot of surveillance, and the business was shifting. It was becoming really competitive in the industry. And a lot of these insurance companies were really bearing down on pricing and really sort of hitting up these firms to lower their fees. So in the period a couple of years before I had joined, my father's firm had sort of taken sort of a different tact and started going more after law firms and things like that. And you know, one of the things that became sort of, because of the growth of the internet and because of the growth of that kind of business, a lot of online research sort of became a big sort of selling point and a big sort of product that we were able to use, sort of open source intelligence. court records, media records, those kind of things. And because of the power of the internet, there was so much more available to us. So I kind of grew up in the business in that age of online records and public records and open sources. And over time, it's just kind of become my little niche. I do a lot of work for a lot of law firms, a lot of other big investigative firms in New York City and around the world. And I've been on my own now for 8 years or so. And as Hal mentioned, I started this blog 7 years ago or so, and I write about stuff that's interesting to me. A lot of it has to do with open source intelligence. It was sort of meant as like a tool to start attracting and marketing to potential clients, but it's become, I've got this huge following of other investigators that which has been great. It's been sort of a back and forth. And I talk about sources that I come up with, techniques that I use, and that's what I've been doing for the past 15 years or so.
I want to ask you a couple things real quick about your blog. I know that sometimes, and I know that Brian and I kind of sussed this out a little bit ahead of time, what we're going to talk about, but I'm going to throw you a couple of curveballs along the way, Brian, just because as we talk, I remember things. Your blog gets a really good response. You sometimes get called out by investigators out there in the field for sharing things that they feel like you shouldn't, or talking about things that they feel like you shouldn't. Talk to me a little bit about your attitude towards blogging and why you do it the way you do it.
Yeah, this has just become sort of part of my ethos. I am, one of the things that I dedicated myself to early was becoming open and transparent about how I operate. And I think for most investigators, that's a very uncomfortable position to be in part because, there's a little bit of cloak and dagger stuff going on in our business that people don't want to reveal their secrets, which are really not secrets at all. Secret sources or secret ways to obtain information, or they're just embarrassed that, they did a Google search and they were able to come up with some information. So it's part of sort of my ethos that I am this open, transparent guy. If you ever get to know me, I certainly speak my mind quite often. Things just roll off my tongue. I curse like a truck driver. And that's just who I am. I kind of, what you see is what you get. And I want to develop my business around that. And that's not comfortable to everybody, but that's just how I decided to operate. And just a quick side story, I'm going through this whole process right now of, doing renovation on my house. I bought a house recently and doing quite a bit of renovation. And it's interesting because a lot of the people that I'm choosing to do the renovations, construction is probably a notorious business of people ripping you off and taking your money and running. And the people I choose to do business with are the people that I like personally and who are just completely open and transparent, saying like, listen, it's going to cost you this much, but this is not the way I would do it. This is the way I would do it. This is, so that's just kind of how I've operated. And I started blogging, just talking about stuff that I do on a daily basis. And I've been called out a lot on it. And, very close friends of mine who say, what are you doing? You're giving up all of our secrets, so to speak. But I think, to me, there's a couple of reasons for it. One is it's a marketing tool. I think, anybody who, is trying to find an investigator who typically have this, this vision. Most investigators are considered sort of this cloak and dagger and those kind of things. If you're looking for an investigator who's not like that, who's open and transparent, they're going to find somebody like me who believe me. And I get a lot of inquiries online, and people say, hey, I really like you and who you are and what you're about. And that's really important to me. I want people to hire me because they like me, but it also attracts people who are like-minded, who are like me. I'm not going to get a guy who wants to, steal his wife's car or his identity or break into somebody's house. Those kind of people aren't going to call me because they can read on my website that that's just not the person who I am. So for me, it has, there's several ways that that it's been really important to me, and that's just kind of who I am.
That's great. I can say for sure that Brian does in fact speak his mind. He doesn't hold back when he has an opinion, and that's one of the reasons Brian and I get along so well. I try to do the same thing myself. Let's jump into the actual topic for the day. I think there are a number of things we could talk about today, but first of all, let's just kind of get an idea of what exactly is open source intelligence. You hear people say this word all the time. What does it mean, open source intelligence?
I kind of, you know, there's all these kooky terms. People use OSINT as a term, open source intelligence, public records. What I consider, and I'm putting this in a broad category, is anything that I can find openly and freely without any restrictions. So it doesn't require me to have a sort of special license. You know, it doesn't have, you know, there are no restrictions to it, which is hard for some investigators to think because anybody can get this stuff. It's just a matter of knowing where to get it. So I kind of put that in a broad category of, you know, we're talking about anything that's available on the internet, anything that's available at your public library, and the public, you know, public records would be anything that is sort of that's a government issued document or a government, something that is issued by the state or federal government, which would be court records or corporate records or litigation judgments or liens or registration documents for certain professions. So it runs the gamut of a lot of things, and social media obviously has become a very big part of that, and part of this open source intelligence and what you can mine from that. So it's a very broad term, and I know that people like to use, you know, very specific terms for these kind of things, but it's basically anything I could sit behind my computer and get, or beyond that, which I know is something we'll wind up talking about later, anything that may not be on the computer. So there's a lot of resources that are not been digitized, mostly historical records that might be really valuable. Historical newspaper clippings or historical property records and things along those lines that might be really valuable.
Right. And I think it's important to remember that when we're talking about open source intelligence and places to find information, there are so many places to find information from, you know, I know that you have done this as well, Brian, but the hours upon hours spent in the bowels of some courthouse or some newspaper office digging through clippings, that's useful information. It's intelligence. It is stuff about things that we're trying to investigate, and it's available. Sometimes you have to work to get it. I know that a lot of times when I'm doing research on someone and I've got documents in 6 or 7 different counties, we'll actually hire, and I know you do this as well, we'll actually hire someone to go to the courthouse and pull paper on that person so we can see if there's anything, you know, nearby that record that may be pertinent to this, to the situation. But yeah, I mean, the wealth of information out there is to me astonishing. What is, Brian, what is, when you get an assignment and you're just starting out, you're just kind of doing your initial, like, first toe in the water research, what's your starting spot? Where do you start?
You know, I think the first place that I always go is to Google. And I think that's kind of just like an obvious answer to everybody. But, you know, the research that I do is typically really, really in-depth. And I'm spending 10, 15, 20, up to 100 hours on researching a topic or a person or a company or things. So I'm just trying to get at my, as you mentioned, your toe in the water and just trying to get a sense of what I'm getting into. So if I'm doing research, I'm going to use you as a guinea pig today, Hal, on Hal Humphreys. You know, I'm going to be digging around and just saying, hey, what's Hal Humphreys' deal? And do a couple of Google searches on him. Is he very prominent? What kind of businesses has he been involved with? Does he have any sort of immediately identifiable social media profiles? Has he written any books? What businesses has he been involved with? Just trying to get a general sense about him. But also what I'm doing with that is I'm trying to get a sense of, excuse me, if there are a bunch of other Hal Humphreys. So if there are 18 other Hal Humphreys, other ones that are very prominent, it kind of gives me a sense of what I'm getting into. Am I going to have to digging through 18 pages of Google searches or hundreds of lawsuits to identify, the right guy or what's going on? So almost universally, that's what I will do. And I'll spend a good half hour just trying to figure out what I'm getting myself into and picking up little clues about who they are, and what they're about. And, I'm probably going to use you as a guinea pig, Hal, for most of this. But, one of the things that about Hal, and some people don't know, is his real name is not Hal. So that's obviously something that is critical when you're doing open source research on somebody or any kind of research on somebody, is you want to know what their real name is and what their sort of nickname is, because most official sort of government documents, corporate records, real property records, criminal records will have their official name, but other records may not. So them on the web, their social media profile might have their nickname, or there was another one, civil litigation. So lawsuits may be, I know some guy may just only know you as Hal, and they're going to file a lawsuit against Hal. They don't know that you may have been Thomas all these years. So that's where I always start.
I'm gonna do a quick thing here. You see up on the screen. This is a simple Google search on the name Hal Humphreys, and you can see there are a number of versions of the Hal image up there. But there's also about, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4 lines down. You see a picture of Brian Willingham on the screen. So there is some kind of a connection between the two of us. I always get a kick out of this. There's you can see this young lady over here on the right-hand side of the screen, third line down. And if I click on that, there's a guy named Hal Sparks and a girl named Samantha Humphreys. And every time you do a search for Hal Humphreys, her picture comes up, which I find kind of humorous. Anyway, we'll stop sharing that screen right now. But again, this is an example of the kind of things you can come up with really quickly if you just pop into Google. And I know this is so basic as to be almost laughable, but I think it's useful to show that and kind of show people where they're going to get their start if they start looking for information on someone. Any more thoughts on where to start, Brian?
I'll just going to jump in and show you a quick example of that. And again, this is laughable as well, but I'm doing a search on Brian Willingham. If I'm doing research on me, obviously I'm logged into my own Gmail account. So obviously a lot of stuff is going to come up on me. But what you'll see is that there's a gentleman who was with the Flint Police Department who wrote a book about the soul of a black cop. And there's another gentleman by the name of Brian Willingham. He's black and I'm white. So obviously we can figure that out pretty quickly. There's another gentleman who lives out in California who is a mortgage broker. So those are the kind of things that I'm trying to figure out. All right, is there other prominent people named Brian Willingham? This guy is out in California, so I know there's not going to be much overlap with records. There's another guy in Michigan who's black, who's a little bit older, and I can ignore some of those things. So those are the kind of things that I would sort of be looking at.
Okay, so once we've kind of done the first pass and Google searched the person's name or the topic that we're trying to find some information on, let's talk a little bit, and I think people will find this entertaining. Let's talk a little bit about deep web and dark web. What is the deep web? You hear people say this all the time. They'll say, "Oh, I did a deep web search." What does that mean?
Well, there's a couple meanings of it. Obviously, there's this whole sort of sketchy, people selling human body parts on the web. So there's this whole sort of sketchy area with Tor and all this stuff that you can find that if you really dig far enough down, and buying credit cards and credit card numbers and social security numbers. But I think for our purposes and the parts that I'm really interested in is sort of the deep web, the dark web, however you want to term it. Is stuff that's sort of not available on the surface of the internet. So it's stuff that's not necessarily on a Google search. So you would have to go to a separate source to search something. Some estimates suggest that Google's indexing only covers about 3% of what's available on the internet. There's tons of other information out there. So for example, if you go to a courthouse website and there's a search box on there that says, type in somebody's name, there's obviously millions of data points behind there that aren't included on the surface web because Google is not smart enough yet, I imagine they will be at some point, to type in a name and get all the results and then have those results sort of indexed by Google. So there's millions and millions upon millions of cases of that. And if you can think about it, just library databases, news media databases, court records, property records, things along those lines of just tons and tons of information that wouldn't necessarily be on the surface. So for example, if I need, in Facebook is another perfect example, not everything is indexed on Google for Facebook. Sometimes you have to have your own account on Facebook and then you can access more information. And even beyond that, many people turn on privacy features that don't allow you to obtain anything that's on there, what's on their profile. So there's layers upon layers of information that is technically out on the internet, but is sort of deep web, dark web, beyond sort of a normal sort of surface search.
Let's talk a little bit now about, we've talked about this before. I use this phrase in presentations that I give to attorneys a lot of times. Kind of people think private investigators have superpowers or secret powers. I know that looking for information on the internet, sometimes we know little tricks or little tips that can help someone get to a thing quicker. What is your favorite superpower? What is the thing that you go to that is your top secret superpower?
Yeah, there's a couple of them there's a couple of sources that I have that will certainly have broken open a number of cases for me before. And one of the sources that I didn't mention as part of sort of the deep or dark web was archive.org, which everybody probably knows about. But archive.org is a website that is capturing historical information on various websites. So the web is a living, breathing thing. If you go on to ESPN.com today, you will see what's on the front page of ESPN.com or Apple.com. But that doesn't necessarily mean that was what was on it 10 days ago or 2 years ago or 4 years ago. So what archive.org is doing is capturing historical points. It doesn't capture it every day. It only captures a certain amount of websites. But that can be an enormously valuable thing. I'm doing a case right now where I'm trying to identify connections between these two parties. There's some pretty clear connections. They both went to the same school. We think that they belong to the same business. But part of my research is going to be digging through some archived websites and trying to find if I can see if these guys work together at some point, or they're both listed as an officer, director, or part of the leadership of a particular company. So archive.org is literally broken open so many websites before that I can't even begin to count. The other one is domain tools, which I use quite often as well. So domain tools, again, most people know that you can search, do a whois search, determine who the owner of a domain is. So domains have to be registered under a name of a registrant. And more you're finding that people are registering them under a proxy so they can hide who they are, who's actually registering the website. But domain tools, what we'll do is similar to archive.org, is it's capturing who owned a website over a period of time. So more and more people are becoming conscious of more and more people are becoming conscious of, protecting their privacy and using a proxy to register these websites, but they may not have been so safe in the past. And there's been a couple of cases where I worked on, we're trying to get behind who's behind this website. It was, might have been having some derogatory information about a company or an entity, trying to figure out who's behind it. And you look up the whois and it's a proxy or it's somebody who's totally unrelated. But if you go into the historical domain information, you might find little nuggets of information about who originally registered the domain, if it was transferred from one person to the next. There's been dozens upon dozens of cases in which that's been really helpful to me. The other thing that it offers too is it offers some search features. So I can search all the registrants of all the domains of all time and under a certain name of Hal Humphreys, for example, and see how many domains that Hal has registered. I can search by an address, I can search by an email, I can search by a phone number. So you may be able to identify domains that somebody has registered over time. Those are, I think, and again, these aren't giant secrets that somebody has. It's, but these are certainly a couple of websites that, I can think of multiple times that have done absolute sort of wonders for me.
Yeah, and I think the being able to go back through those archive websites, it's surprising to me the amount of information you can find in old registries. We did have one question from Veritas Investigations. They're asking about how you might use web analytics. Do you ever deal with web analytics?
Sorry, I muted myself there. I do use web analytics for my own website, but I don't utilize it for, I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, somebody out there much smarter than me. That's the other thing too, is I don't ever pretend to be the smartest person in the room and certainly don't know everything. But I think most analytic information, is privatized. Nobody can see who's been on my website. So I analyze my own website for marketing purposes, but other people's websites, I don't necessarily, I don't know how accurate or full the information is to be able to get any real use out of it.
The historical information that you see on domain registry, is that available at the Whois website as well? Is that the same thing? We've got a question from the audience on that as well.
Sure. No, so it's not. So the Whois will provide you with who's the current registrant or owner of a website. It'll give you the most accurate, up-to-date information. But any historical information, you'd have to go to a third party to get. I'm sure there's more websites out there or more tools that provide it than Domain Tools. That happens to be the one that I use. And most of their services are paid services. I think it costs $49 or $99 to get a report on a specific domain. So that hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it does. Let's talk a little bit about you and I have discussed this issue a number of times in a number of different ways. I know that I've had this question asked of me so many times as to be not annoying, but you get it so much. What proprietary databases do you use, and what do you use them for? And the reason I ask it that way is I know there are a lot of PI firms out there that will take a TLO search, for instance, change the header and footer to their own logo and turn that in as a background investigation.
Yeah, listen, I consider TLO and IRB, and there's a lot of databases out there that are extraordinarily valuable, but I consider them to be an absolute starting point, in conducting any type of investigation. So yeah, there's tons of great proprietary databases. I think it's a question that a lot of us get frequently. What's your favorite? And the reality is, I don't really have a favorite, and I think that's kind of skirting the question a little bit. But the reality is, and this is something that I talk about in the course that we released, and I talk about frequently with other people, is that I am a huge proponent of multi-sourcing every single search that I do, because I don't trust any of these databases, and that's not a bad thing. It's that I'm not just going to hand somebody a report, a TLO report, for example, which I know is absolutely complete. So if anybody out there thinks that that TLO is absolutely complete and has criminal records and around the country, that's just not true. So I use a variety of databases. TLO is absolutely, and they're not they're not paying me for this either, but TLO is definitely one of my sort of primary sources. And the reason it's become is because I find it to be very useful. It's very easy to use. The easy use, I think, is among the best of all the websites. Their information is generally pretty accurate. I don't rely on it 100%. I'm interested in phone numbers for a lot of people, and they tend to provide a lot more phone numbers than some of the other databases. But there's a lot of good ones out there. LexisNexis is something that I rely upon pretty frequently as well. I have a full subscription to all their public records research, which is several $100s a month. It's an enormously valuable tool to me. If I had to choose one, that probably would be one of the ones, because it's just got so much incredible information in there.
All right. Well, hey, let me do this real quick. I know you just mentioned the course that you worked on with us, and this is going to be a total straight up plug here at the middle of the hour. We've got on offer right now for 1 day, 10 hours, 28 minutes, and 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 seconds remaining, a 50% off flash sale for Brian Willingham's masterclass on open source investigations. This masterclass is the first one that we put together with Pursuit and PI Education. We're pretty excited about it. It's a painfully dense class. There's a lot of information in here. There's also some takeaways you can carry home with you at the end of this class if you choose to buy it. I'm going to recommend strongly right now, at 50% off, it's a great chance to get a look at this course and spend some time learning about how to do some deep dive searches for that kind of work. So that's the plug for you, Brian, right there. I'm going to move on now and let's talk a little bit about. I want to go back to some kind of secret resources that people sometimes don't think about. I think this is a kind of thing that, and I'm trying to share my screen over here. I'm going to the application window. All right. So, for instance, if you're trying to locate a witness and you want to find a specific piece of property that they own in a specific place, you have some information on them, but you're not sure. Say maybe they're in Middle Tennessee somewhere. That gives you a certain number of counties to search through. Most property assessors across the country will have an online portal where they will provide their records online. And this is just an example of Tennessee's real estate assessment data. And I'm going to do a real quick search here. We're going to go to Perry County, Tennessee. And we're going to look for any property owned by Humphreys. Because as Brian mentioned earlier, my actual name is not Hal Humphreys. That's a nickname. My name is Thomas Humphreys. So I did a quick search on that. The fun thing about the assessor databases is, and in most places, they'll have GIS maps. So we'll just look here. We're looking down the screen. We've got Humphreys County Utility. We know that's not me. Raymond doesn't match. Teresa may be a wife, but we're not sure. But down here at the bottom, you see Thomas H. Humphreys. Pretty sure that's me. Click on it and it shows up, Thomas Humphreys, Kimberly Green. It's got address, all kinds of information on there that's public information that's readily available to anyone. But here's another fun thing you can usually do. If you click on the GIS link, you can actually see where the parcel is and see where the person lives or where the property is. I've personally used this approach to identify witnesses and where they live and get a really specific address for someone. So that's one example of kind of deep web research. It's not going to show up on a Google index. It's not going to show up if you just like type in, I want to find X, Y, or Z. But if you know where to go find the thing, it's available. Some other resources, Brian, from you, some other resources like that people can go to that they might not have thought of before.
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely excellent point, Hal. I think, a lot of attorneys or whatever the case may be looking for a specific address on somebody. So being able to pinpoint a specific address. And that's one thing that I'll always do and check. TLO, IRB, Tracer's Info, Skip Smasher, whatever you want to use. They all provide pretty good up-to-date information about address history. So they may have an address history that shows that somebody last reported it in August of 2017. It's not always accurate though. So I will always go to something like an assessor's office, go to the GIS or property records and figure out if they actually own the address, which would be really helpful. So one of the things that I'm going to share as my sort of secret source, which I think we got up on the screen. Can you see that, Hal?
Yes, I can.
All right, cool. So is Facebook. So I have a fake Facebook account. Don't tell Mark Zuckerberg because this is totally illegal. But I have a fake sort of Facebook account. One of the things that you can do and that a lot of people don't realize is you can type a phone number up here of anybody that you may be doing your investigation on and trying to come up with a profile that matches them. So you can type anybody's phone number up in the search box, just 914-500-8790 with the dashes in it, and it'll pop up anybody that might be associated with that profile. So in that particular case I'm mentioning, that's my business number. Nothing's going to come up, but it's an interesting tool if you're trying to verify that somebody is associated with a phone number. That may come up. The other thing that I love there's all this fascinating information on Facebook that is not sort of publicly out there. So this is Mark Zuckerberg. Mark Zuckerberg is the founder of Facebook, in case you don't know, and CEO. And this is his Facebook page. So he's got all this public stuff, and there's obviously a lot of information out here. He's very public in what he does. But what's interesting is there's a whole level of detail of information that is not necessarily on here that you might be able to glean some really interesting things from. So one of the websites that I use is, and we'll probably have Sam, you might want to put this into the chat box afterwards, is Intel Techniques. So inteltechniques.com is this incredible source of information. If you don't know about it, definitely look it up. It's run by a guy named Michael Bazzell. He's written a couple of books, and it's just an absolutely fabulous source. If you go to the tools here, there's a bunch of tools on the left for Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and you can use these tools for all kinds of really fascinating things. Go ahead, Al.
I was going to say, well, I think you're about to do it. Just if you don't mind, run us through one of the Facebook searches that this thing can do. Because once you showed me this tool, I was totally blown away by it. So,
all right. So this might be a little bit hard to see, but so at the end of facebook.com/Zuck, Z-U-C-K, that's his name. If you did me, it would be Brian-Willingham or Brian.Willingham. That is somebody's sort of unique identifier. So if you go into this Intel Techniques tool, you paste the name under this little screen right here where it's Facebook username. And if you hit go, it'll give you his Facebook unique identification. So he's number 4. Most of the time, if you've ever used Facebook or if you ever use this tool, the number is like 82 digits long, but Mark Zuckerberg, since he was the founder of the company, I would imagine he gets a low number. So what I'm doing is just pasting this into all these categories here. And what you can see is once you paste their unique identification number, so that identification number is only for Mark Zuckerberg and nobody else. From there, you can do a lot of these really interesting searches, photos of tags. So these are photos that Mark Zuckerberg would be tagged in, but not necessarily photos that he posted. So here's a good example right here. Andrei Alexandrescu posted a photo and tagged Mark Zuckerberg. So this would be, if I could search through Mark Zuckerberg's profile day and night, I would never find this because Andre posted this on his page, and he tagged him. So because of this Intel Techniques tool, you're able to sort of mine some of the data that's behind Facebook. So, in this particular case, Mark Zuckerberg is a very public person, and there's going to be tons of photos of him being posted by other people. But there's tons of other interesting tools here, like photo comments is always a good one too. So these are photos that Mark Zuckerberg commented on. Now, in this particular case, you're going to have to scroll through dozens upon dozens of comments. This one's actually not bad. So if you just look at the comments, the chicken back, oh, that was a chicken wrapped in bacon inside a duck, wrapped inside a bacon inside a turkey, inside a pig. It was delicious. So you can see this is a post made by Dean Spinks, who's obviously a friend of his, with Mark Zuckerberg from 2013. And you can see comments that he made. That could be an enormously valuable thing in your investigation. I spent just over the weekend, I worked all last weekend, about 23 hours. And I probably spent about 8 of those hours mining through Facebook. I was trying to identify connections and links to people. So it was an enormously, valuable tool for me. The other one that I think that I'll just mention real quick is this little, and this might be hard to see as well, but it's something that is mentioned in the course as well. Just a little short plug there. But is this little tool, it's from Intelligence Software. If you go to intel-sw.com, you can get this little tool. And what this tool allows you to do is, it allows me to do kind of quick searches. It allows me to search on Facebook for a particular person whose name is James Marshall, let's say. So what it'll do is it'll come up with all the people that are named James Marshall. Now that's not, and you can go to Facebook and do that yourself. This is really not all that interesting. But where it really does get interesting is you can add in all these really interesting and unique characteristics. So if I wanted to find a James Marshall who lives currently present in California, I can do that as well. So it'll kind of narrow down the list of subjects. These are the people, this person lives in Berkeley, this person lives in San Jose. So I can narrow it down even further by some place where they, maybe where they work. If they worked ever at Google. So I'm trying to find a James Marshall who lives in California who works at Google. Now this is totally random, but there happens to be a guy. So there, I found my guy. But the point is that you can, James Marshall is a really common name. So I'm trying to find people who may fit certain characteristics that I may or may not know about. I use that tool all the time, and you can see, there's nothing sort of extraordinary about this tool, but it does make it sort of nice and easy for you to do. And if you'll notice here on Intel Techniques, they have some of these tools as well. Intel Techniques goes into a little bit more detail. The nice thing, I use Google Chrome frequently, and the nice thing about this little tool is it's kind of sort of always sitting there sort of waiting for me. So that wound up being a nice little sample. I swear to you, Hal, I did not do that ahead of time.
I don't believe you. So I think this is a really good place to point out, number one, if you're doing open source intelligence research and you're working at home doing your thing, you can run down rabbit hole after rabbit hole after rabbit hole and spend hours upon hours upon hours following those different trails. There is a way to do this that is maybe a little bit more thoughtful, and I know that Brian does that when he starts a project. I do that as well. You've got to kind of narrow down the way you approach these things. The reason I bring that is we spent a good amount of time going through that OSINT tool, which is a fantastic tool, but we're getting down to about 15 minutes left, and we've got some questions here. So Brian, I'm going to just ask you a couple of questions as we go along here. Do you have any techniques for getting info from private mailbox rental places?
Private mailbox rental places. I don't. I think one of the things that I would always, I guess you're trying to get behind who's a private mailbox. Obviously, if for legal reasons, if you can serve a subpoena, obviously that is something that you can always do. What I tend to do with those kind of things is there may be a bunch of records. So for example, somebody may be associated with a private mailbox, and you're trying to find people who are other people who may be associated. So there may be other records in other places. Somebody might be registering. So for example, if you find somebody that is linked to an address and you're trying to find other people that are linked to an address, or corporations or businesses, there may be other databases out there that you can search utilizing that address to see who's behind it. Maybe somebody has reported it before, do a TLO search on just that address, see other people that have used it before. Maybe when a corporate registration was filed or a DBA filing, maybe that person used the address. Maybe in real property records, somebody is using that PO box. You may find a signature of somebody. So that might be a way to sort of get behind who's that, unmask who's behind that sort of PO box. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it does. Somebody, let's see, Stephanie asked, what's your favorite telephone number search? If you're not going to use one of the databases that we use on a regular basis that are kind of proprietary, how do you go about finding phone numbers?
I only use proprietary databases. And the simple reason is because I know that time is of the essence. When I'm working on a case, people pay a lot of money per hour, and it doesn't make sense for me to use some online resource. And I'm probably not an answer that somebody wants to hear. But for example, people always ask my opinion on Intellius or, PeopleSmart or one of these. And the reality is I've never used them because I've got things that are so much better than them. So if I wanted to go quickly get a phone number, TLO would be my source. I don't typically use the free unpaid stuff.
And I will say that I've had people that I've worked with in the past, they come to me and they say, look, I've been searching Intellius, or I've been searching People Finder or whatever, and they have spent to date $50, $60, $70, and they're getting 3 and 4 and 5 year old information. The reason I say that is just caution investigators. One of the reasons we pay so much to have access to these databases is they're going to have about the most current information you can have. Now, there are, as Brian said earlier, there are countless databases out there. There's TLO TransUnion, there's Skipmaster, there's Clear, there's LexisNexis. There are countless databases that have information. If you can afford it, it's good to have 2 or 3 or 4 to cross-reference and see what's what. But if you can't, you've still got to take the time to go through and make sure that the information you get out of that database is accurate. I know that a lot of times I spend time trying to find telephone numbers for people. And at the end of the day, there are people who will say, I'm not money motivated. I'm doing this because I really love the work. And I get that, but we've all got to pay the bills somehow. So we can't take too much time to try and find a phone number. My grandfather would say, taking 2 hours to find a phone number to avoid paying $10 for a search is like stepping over $1 to pick up a dime. It's wasteful. So as investigators, I'm going to suggest that you avail yourself of the opportunity to have access to some of these databases. I know we have a lot of journalists that are in the class today, and you may not be able to have the full access that we have, but it's still a really good resource to look into. Another question real quick. We've got one. This is a good one. I think Brian's going to be able to talk on this for a little bit. Jason Addis, a really good friend of mine out of Waco, Texas, super investigator. If you work in Texas and you're an attorney and you need an investigator, I can highly recommend Jason. He's a good guy. He says, how do you save all the relevant info you find through these different sites? If you're saving a photo, how do you note the site and the image data? And Stephanie also asked kind of a attendant question to that. How do you organize all this stuff? There's a lot of stuff you're going through.
It's a great point. And I think it's one of sort of the underused or unsung heroes sort of in doing this kind of thing is that you really have to be organized. I have checklists, which is something that we talk about in the course. I have as much as this scenario and doing my investigation online has been a little bit scattered, I am, very thorough and methodic about how I do my research. I do research, I analyze the data, and I report on the data, and then I start all over again and try to fill in some holes. So a couple of things that I would use. One is I'll plug Hunchly. Hunchly is something that I don't use probably as often as others do. But you can, Rochelle Davis, I forgot the name, New Hope Investigations, I think it is. She wrote a nice little review on it. Hunchly basically will sit there, it sits in the background and records everything that you're doing. And the nice thing about that is that you never have to, I'm sure that people have done this before, but, and Hal mentioned this before, when you're investigating, you go down hundreds of rabbit holes, you might find a website and forgot how you got there, or click out of it and never see it again. With Hunchly, it saves all that stuff in the background. So it's constantly sort of monitoring what you're searching, saving everything. If you ever need to reference it again, if it disappears from the web, it's there. That's something that I would strongly look into. I probably don't use it nearly as much as I should. The other thing is, I often just save PDFs. I use Chrome. I'll save a lot of things as PDFs. When I'm doing LexisNexis research, TLO research, I'll print screens using PDFs. I wind up having hundreds upon hundreds of documents in my folder when I'm doing this research. I'm also keeping a checklist of everything that I'm doing along the way. So I think that's an absolutely critical part of this. I think if you work on something like criminal defense work, or something that you know is with 100% certainty is going to court or may become a real issue in court, I would strongly consider using Hunchly. My cases don't often end up that way, so I don't have as much concern of it. There's a few cases I can recall from my past where I had to recall some research that I did, and luckily I had saved it as a PDF. There was an article that disappeared off the web that was very critical of a gentleman who I think was in the oil business in Costa Rica or something. And it disappeared from the web. He was going to be an owner of a major sports team, and I was able to retrace my steps, and I was able to find it, I think through archive.org, but I might have saved the copy. But using something like Hunchly would have actually been really helpful. And in Rochelle's case, she mentioned a specific example of where it literally saved their bacon. So definitely check that out.
Yeah, I think that's key, is the idea of keeping track of what you're doing as you're doing it. I use Hunchly as well, thanks to Brian's introduction of the service to me. I will say this: I don't use it as often as I should. I try not to keep it turned on all the time, just because I don't want to have all of my personal stuff saved like that. But it's a fantastic tool. There are a couple of questions coming in right now about criminal databases and what's the most popular ones to use. I think we go back to the idea that Brian was talking about. There are several services out there that you can use to get background information and criminal history information. I do a lot of work in Texas, and I will say this: the proprietary databases we have access to a lot of times don't have up-to-date information in Texas specifically, because Texas Department of Public Service collects information at the county level, but not all of the counties report that in a timely fashion. So I actually ran into a case several years ago where I had a witness on the stand who I had pulled the background information and found the documents associated with them through the databases that I'd searched, but I did not call at the county level and get more detailed information. So again, think about this information. If you're using proprietary databases, especially for criminal histories, it might not be the most current. You might need to call at the county level and find out if there's any new documentation on the person. Real quick, we've got another question in. Ruben says, what happens when you save images, pages, but the subject erases them? Is your image capture acceptable in a court, or is there a way to save the metadata to prove it existed and is not doctored? Brian, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is something that I don't have a whole lot of experience with, and that's just speaking the truth there. I don't do a lot of cases that end up in court. What I have done in particular cases is I save them as PDFs that includes all the metadata. You know, the reality is that I don't know if that's the absolute proper thing to do. You're better off talking to somebody who has more knowledge of that particular area. But it's never been a situation for me yet. I imagine it may be at some point. But again, there is a particular case, and I'm trying to think of the website. So the one case that I'm particularly interested in telling you about, sorry for my loss of train of thought. I think the website's called PageVault, PageVault. There may be a hyphen in there. I knew there was a case where we knew that a lot of stuff was ultimately going to disappear from the web, and we wanted to capture it as quickly as possible and to have it admissible in court. The way that they capture it, and this was specific to a case that I was working on, the way that they capture the information makes it absolutely admissible in court. They will provide an affidavit that shows that, you know, it was captured on this day and all the information relating to it, that it has not been doctored. So if you are working on a particular case where you know that something is going to be taken down, like in this particular case, there's a number of services. PageVault happened to be the one that I picked. I think they're based out of Chicago. They were very helpful. We saved about 100 pages on the web. It was relating to some information that they had posted on the web that we wanted to make sure that we had captured before they took it down. So.
And I'll add to that Hunchly is the thing I like about Hunchly is it actually saves every step along the way so that you can go back and recreate the search that you did, and it shows what happened as you go along and that kind of business. So you would need to talk to your attorney about what is considered admissible as evidence, especially with internet-based stuff. But I have found Hunchly to be the most robust tool to use in my daily practice for things like this, just so that I can go back and show exactly what I did, all the steps I took. And at the end of the day, if you end up on the witness stand, which if I'm on the witness stand as a private investigator doing criminal cases, something's gone wrong. They don't want me on the stand. I know, I'm involved in case strategy and proprietary information. So there are a lot of things Hunchly can do to kind of keep those things lined up so you know what you're talking about. So those are just some things to think about for Hunchly and how to organize and how to stay organized. If you approach your research in an organized fashion, that's going to show up on Hunchly as well, and that makes you look more professional. I think Brian's got a screen share. I think we've got Brian, we're about 3 minutes from the end of this webinar. If you can do this screen share real quick, and then we'll wrap this up in the next couple of minutes.
So criminal records, I could speak endlessly about this. I know somebody had a quick question about it before. I think it's one of the topics that is so widely misunderstood, even amongst investigators. And there is no one database that will capture most or all of the criminal records. And the reality is that most of them are completely full of bullshit. And the reason I say that is because, I don't have any real numbers, but I know that many states don't sell any of their information to these database providers, including New York, which is a state that I'm obviously based in and is important to me because a lot of my subjects actually belong here. So there's a couple of tips that I would give. One is whatever database that you use, I'm sure it's better than nothing, but I would never rely on one database. One of the things that I always recommend to people is using some sort of official sort of database. And in this particular case, I have up on the website here, is a map that I put together of states that offer statewide criminal checks. In New York specifically, if I click on this, and it kind of gives you a little bit of detail about what's involved in there. A New York criminal check costs $65. It's actually $66. It's the only way to do it. And a number of other states have these services where you can do criminal checks in that state. A word of caution, an example, Hal mentioned this before, the Texas Department of Public Safety has a $3 search that you can do. It is completely reliant on the local agencies supplying this information to the Texas Department of Public Safety. There's been studies out there that suggest that 30 or 40% of information gets up to the Texas Department of Public Safety. So it's not, even a state agency is not something I would completely rely on. So with criminal records, it's something that, you know, I think I can speak about this endlessly, but a couple things I think you need to do is, one is to do as many on-site searches as you possibly can. Actually physically go to the court, use the court website or whatever. Use multiple sources to try to identify criminal records, and make sure you're hitting all the places that the person lives. So those are my couple quick tips about doing criminal record searches.
Okay, we are at 2 o'clock, which is the official end of the webinar, but we're going to stick with it here for a couple of seconds and remind you guys, number one, go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel if you don't mind. It'll be a way to keep up with the videos we produce. We appreciate you being here today. I'm thrilled at the number of people in this webinar. I think one of the things we've realized is open source intelligence research is such a big topic. It is impossible to cover it in 1 hour, even with an expert like Brian. So here's one final plug from this webinar. There is a 48-hour flash sale that is running out quickly right now on Brian Willingham's masterclass. We've provided the link in the emails. You'll find the link on our social media sites. If you have not taken advantage of purchasing that class, I'm going to tell you right now, you need to do that, because there's virtually 10 hours of video of Brian talking about his tips and tricks, showing you how to use the tools, going through screen captures of how to use the tools. And there's some takeaways at the end, some handouts, some things that you can use to improve your investigative skills. Brian, thank you so much for being here today. I can't thank you enough. So all I'm going to say is thank you.
Thanks. It's been really enjoyable. And, you know, one last thing, I'm sure this is, people are floating off here. There are no magic and secrets to what we do. And that's just the reality of it. You know, what it takes is time and effort and research. Some of the things that you've heard today are probably things that you've all used and utilized before. And like Hal mentioned before, it's about, you know, knowing the tools exist and how and when to, you know, use them. And in a lot of cases, it's just a matter of putting in the time and effort to do that research. So I hope you enjoyed this. I always enjoy looking at Hal's face for an hour on my screen. Love looking at that beard. So I hope it's been enjoyable for you as well.
Yeah, and I'm going to pop this this advertisement up one more time before we leave here, if I can. Let's go to screen share, application window, and share this. This is the link to the flash sale. It's at pieducation.com/open-source-intelligence-landing-page or landing-page / Go to that website, sign up for today if you get a chance. One last time, thank you guys for being here. We really appreciate it. Brian, thank you again. Everybody have a great afternoon and a great weekend.